Greetings. Welcome to our conversations on COVID and development. Today, I'm very pleased and privileged to have with us the Right Honourable Gordon Brown. I'm very happy, Gordon, that you can join us today.
Well, thank you for the work that the Centre for Global Development does. I've always enjoyed working with you. Larry Summers is your chairman. You've got some great staff. I've been reading your blogs. You've actually been very up on many of the issues on this crisis. So it's very good to talk to you.
Thank you. So I thought we might start. Really, we just recently had the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank. Associated with it were meetings of the G7 and the G20, and coming out of that were a set of decisions. And I want to get a little bit your sense of how far do those decisions take us in response to what you have called as a crisis of a lifetime, with the consequences that could be with us for a very long time. How far do you think we are in addressing crisis of that magnitude?
Well, 3.5 million people officially are now have suffered from this disease. 250,000 people have died in different parts of the world. It's a global pandemic. We've probably had 4 of them in the last 20 years, but this is certainly the worst, and it's the most global. It came with massive speed and suddenness as far as the world sees it, and of course its effects will go on for a very long time. And I think what has struck me right from the beginning is the mismatch between the speed of national economic responses in America, in Britain, in Europe in particular, but the speed of these responses and the frugality, if you like, of the international response. So in 2009, when we had a global financial crisis, this is a global medical and financial emergency, but we had a global financial crisis, we understood immediately, I think, that this had to be dealt with at a global level. I think what we're actually finding is that this crisis is being dealt with at a national level, sometimes well, sometimes badly, sometimes well on the economic front, sometimes badly on the medical front. We can go through individual countries. But as far as the global response is concerned, well, you can single out leaders on the global stage who've done a great deal. If you look at the global response as a whole and what has been promised and what may be needed, particularly so since we've got a chance perhaps for some of the developing countries to plan ahead, we haven't done as well as we should. And I think that is a sadness. It probably reflects a different atmosphere in the international community than there was 10 years ago. And I think we can discuss that. But when you look, for example, at the deficits that are being run in the major countries, when you look at the rising debt that is being taken on by the individual national economies, when you hear Kristalina Georgieva, a friend of mine who's head of the IMF, say that 2.5 trillion is needed in the emerging markets, it's difficult to see where that money is coming from at the moment, given the decisions that have been made so far. Now, I'm still hopeful, but I think everybody should be struck by the by this mismatch, and we've got to catch up. This is a global problem. It requires a global solution. If a global pandemic is not a problem that requires global coordination, I don't know what is. And so we have to do better.
Yes. I think that, you put your finger on it, that in a way, if you read the diagnoses coming out of the spring meetings, words like unprecedented, once in a lifetime, there are some very large numbers. I mean, 2.5 trillion that Kristalina has put out, I suspect in the end will turn out to be an underestimate of the impact and the consequences. And then you look at the response side. As you say, there's a sort of gaping divide, a gap between the diagnosis and the response. And yet in 2009, you were very much in the leadership role at that time, as were others, and you were able more quickly to bring together an international coalition that not just recognized the nature of the problem, but was able to see what was required to deal with it. And in that case, I remember well the actions that were taken around increasing the firepower of the IMF and supporting the multilateral development banks to respond. And today you don't see that. And is it, you think, because political leaders are so preoccupied at the moment with what they have to do at home that they can't bring their minds around the international dimension? Is it because people aren't convinced? I mean, the experts are convinced, but the political leadership is either not convinced or not able to convince their own public to support them around these actions? Is it a function of sort of just less of a spirit of multilateralism, international cooperation? The sort of rivalry between the US and China has become much more visible and acute recently. So I'm just trying to get a sense of sort of what do we need to overcome to close that gap?
Well, I think it would be wrong to say it's due to particular individuals, but there is a different atmosphere. I think in 2009, people were prepared to come together to cooperate. I think people very quickly, unfortunately, retreated into the national silos after 2010. And of course, we had austerity in Europe, a different kind of response to the United States of America. But people did seem to go in different directions immediately. The first stage of the crisis was over. And then I think in the last 10 years, we've had two different kinds of protectionism. We started in the earlier years of the decade with what I might call a defensive nationalism. And that was closing borders, cutting back on immigration, the way we dealt with migration, the way we dealt with tariffs that started to be imposed. And you could say the building of walls is another example of that, and maybe is the symbol of that particular period with President Trump's desire to build the wall between Mexico and America. But in, I think, 45 countries, there are 65 walls, many of them that have been built in the last 10 years. So you had this defensive nationalism, which is a really protectionism. And I think that discouraged international cooperation. And you've seen the effect in a number of different organizations. And then you've had, I think, in the last 2 or 3 years, an even more aggressive form of nationalism, not so much defensive, but aggressive. America first, India first, China first, Russia first, Turkey first. You can go through Hungary first. You can go through the examples of where you have leaders that have asserted their nationalist credentials, if you like. And I think what you define as this nationalist ideological approach is seeing the world in terms of us versus them. A zero-sum game. Either I win, but nobody really can win by working together. Then you see it as in a blame culture. Someone else has got to be to blame when things go wrong. Resentments are stoked up. They are mainly imaginary, not real. But it's the invention of enemies where really none exist as a way of answering what are probably problems that leaders within their own national context are finding it difficult to solve. And so immigrants become an issue, and then the other countries become the problem. Communities within your own country that are ethnic communities sometimes become the target. And so we've had since 2010 years of defensive nationalism, which you might call protectionism, and now we've had a period of aggressive nationalism. And so you then come to what should be the most obvious example of where even a nationalist sees the importance of global cooperation.
Yes.
A pandemic. You cannot solve this medical emergency in one country alone. It's got to be solved as a global emergency. The health of each of us is dependent on the health of others in other parts of the world. And you have this probably the best example of why multilateral cooperation is necessary. A public evil that has to be removed, a public good, the control of infectious diseases that has to be promoted. And even then, people find it difficult to cooperate. So America has left, as you know, the UNESCO. It's left at least a large part of UNRWA. It's left the climate change agreement. It's left the SALT agreement on nuclear weapons. It's pulled out of many parts of the World Trade Organization. At least the judicial review is not working at the moment. And of course, it's not a member of the International Criminal Court. And so America first is there, and then it's gone global, and other countries have responded in like mind. And so the atmosphere in which you're trying to deal with what is a global medical emergency and a global economic emergency is rather different from what it was 10 years ago. And I said, look, in a unipolar age, when America was dominant after 1990, at the end of the Cold War, America preferred to act multilaterally.
Yes.
Iraq was probably an example where it didn't, but preferred to act multilaterally, worked within the international institutions. George Bush, for example, put a huge amount of money into dealing with HIV AIDS, and then President Obama in dealing with Ebola. So America in the unipolar age preferred to act multilaterally, and now we're clearly moving into a multipolar age, and America prefers to act unilaterally. And I think this is a problem. But it's not just America. Chinese nationalism, Indian nationalism, Russian nationalism, Turkish nationalism. You can go through the world and you can point to leaders who see the advantage for their own personal positions in their own countries in promoting an us versus them view of the world, and seeing life as a struggle between us and them in a way that blames outsiders when things go wrong. And of course, that's what's happened during this crisis. So the atmosphere in which international cooperation could be successful has changed, and we've got to recognize that. But, you know, I say, look, let's move beyond this debate between globalists and nationalists. Let's understand that some people have taken this nationalist position, that even in the self-interest of any individual country at the moment, solving this pandemic requires international cooperation and requires action together. And I was wanting to outline the three areas where I think we could persuade even a nationalist that they had to act.
Yes, I think maybe just before we go into that, I mean, I very much agree with the point that if you keep couching the need for multilateral cooperation only in terms of, you know, a sort of a value-based proposition that it's a good idea, you know, we should all cooperate because that's a better way to live in this world, that only goes so far today. And I think the point that you're making, that you need to cooperate on finding solutions to certain problems that are global, whether or not you think that you are going to be rivals or friends or allies with the other party. You don't only cooperate with your friends to solve a problem that requires the action of others. And so it's in the self-interest of each country to be part of a process that will deliver a better outcome for them and also for others. And if you go all the way back to the goal, you know, to the start of these international institutions after the Second World War, I mean, they were set up at a time when there was a Cold War. And the Cold War obviously is not a very good analogy for today, but at that time there were a number of agreements reached, not because people wanted to cooperate, but because they recognized that on those issues they needed to cooperate for their own self-interest. And I think in a way that's a new version of this, which somehow has to be articulated.
Well, I remember when you read the history of the period immediately after 1945, or at 1945, Bretton Woods, and then the creation of the United Nations. I mean, the argument was that we're not fighting a war against one country or the other at this stage. We're fighting a war against poverty, against hunger, against disease, against illiteracy. And the argument then was prosperity to be sustained had to be shared across the world. So that was the motivating force behind the attempt at building these great international institutions after 1945. And we have somehow lost sight of the fact. So you can look at climate change, you can look at nuclear proliferation, you look at inequality and the use of tax havens, you can look at financial instability, and you can look at all these issues. And you come, like when you look at pandemics, and say, even however, if you have a nationalist leader who wants to talk only about the self-interest of his own country or her own country, then the benefits of cooperation when it comes to these issues are immense. And when it comes to a global pandemic, it is probably, as I said at the beginning, the most obvious case of where multilateralism has to be effective, or we all lose. And the control of infectious diseases must be seen as one of the great public goods that it's in all our interest to deal with. And so when I talk about what I sometimes call ungoverned spaces around the world, where if you don't act, your own country is going to lose, because that is a space that is ungoverned, and if it's left ungoverned, the spillover to your country could be very dangerous, as has happened with COVID-19. Then the case for acting. So I don't think at this stage in the crisis we need to get into a huge debate about the benefits of, if you like, globalism versus nationalism.
Yes, let's just get on with doing what we need to do.
To understand that if it's difficult to build cooperation at a general level, it's got to be essential to build cooperation issue by issue when there are matters of concern that affect all of us individually. So if the health of all of us depends on the health of each of us around the world, as is becoming true in this pandemic, and if we cannot solve the problem, we're at our weakest link in the poorest countries of the world, then we all suffer greatly. So yes. I think we should try to explain to people, and I think this is all crises are a learning opportunity as well as tragedies in their own right that have got to be dealt with. Explain to people why cooperation is necessary.
So now, maybe in that context, recognizing that we live in a world that we do, and we don't have a lot of time. So we really have a few weeks in which to do some things, and maybe a few months in which to lay the ground for longer term changes, but not much more than that. And so from your perspective, what do you think are the kinds of actions or policy changes that we should prioritize and focus on, and around which we could build enough international consensus to be able to move forward, both for the next 6, 8, 12 months and then sort of thinking a little bit beyond that?
So if someone was saying to me, look, I'm concerned about my own community, I'm concerned about my own family, I'm concerned about my own country, what's this about global cooperation? I would say to them, there are 3 things that we've got to do that is in everybody's interest happen, and they've got to happen quickly. The first is the search and the mass manufacture and then the fair distribution of a vaccine.
Yes.
The second is building the capacity to deal with the treatments and the protection of people in healthcare systems, from testing to ventilators to protective personal healthcare equipment. And the third is preventing the disease hurting most those countries that have got the least developed health systems and the most inadequate safety nets, so that the disease does not come back in a second round or a third round to hit the community that you are most concerned about. So there are 3 big arguments as to why we've got to accelerate the cooperation between countries and have a global response to this pandemic. So let's take vaccine, because I think it's really quite important, because the CP, which is this organized Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, has got together people who are of great quality around the world. So you've got scientists, you've got experts, you've got statisticians, you've got all these people prepared to work together, the epidemiologists, virologists, all prepared to work together to make possible the delivery of a vaccine. You've probably got about 100, maybe more tests, experiments going on in different parts of the world where people are trying to develop vaccines, from Asia to America to Europe. You've maybe got about 5 that are really in development phase at the moment, and 1 or 2 at least have gone into trials. So 1 or 2 of these may be successful. But at the point that there is a success, or at the point in which there is a few that are successful, we've got to get to scaling up, manufacturing, distribution, get it around the world. You're talking about billions of people who need to be protected against this disease. And if we are successful in finding a vaccine, it would be completely unacceptable if only 1 or 2 countries could benefit from that simply because the inventors were in that country and the intellectual property laws were such that they could patent it in such a way that they could either hold it to themselves and make huge sums of money at the expense of ordinary people around the world. So we need,
Unacceptable and ineffective.
and in
Because
effect,
it's pointless because you can be vaccinated and so what?
so the disease keeps coming. So we need a global coordination of this. I'm pleased that there is within the WHO and around CP that kind of cooperation happening. It's a private-public collaboration because Gates and Wellcome Trust and all these very good charities that are interested in health are involved in this as well. There's been a pledging conference this week in Brussels, organised by 6 different countries. I'm sorry, America and China are not part of that, but I hope they'll join later.
Yeah.
And we've got to solve these problems, intellectual property laws. I mean, we have to find a way that this is made available to people at a cheaper price. We have to then mobilize Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunization. It may need IFIM, which I was party to creating, the International Finance Facility for Immunization, to create additional resources. People are saying we're talking about 25, we're talking about a lot of billions that are needed for both the development and the scaling up, and then the mass manufacture, and then the efficient delivery of this. So
just to put it in perspective, 45, sorry to interrupt, but just to put it in perspective, 45 billion sounds like a lot, but we've just spent, 8 trillion in the rich countries trying
because
to
we don't have a vaccine.
Mitigate, so it's really just to put it in perspective.
We had a vaccine, and of course there has been hugely successful efforts in the past. Smallpox is one where the disease has been eradicated because of global cooperation, and even when it came back, and I think it was Somalia, and it was at the 60s, 70s, action was taken and countries came together to eradicate it completely. So it's possible to do this if you find a vaccine, but you need global cooperation to do it. It cannot happen without countries coming together to do so. But I think the second issue in cooperation is as important, and that is testing equipment, that is ventilators, that is protective health equipment. And you can see from what's happening around the world at the moment that we're in a cutthroat competition to each country, sometimes each state within a country, to get this share of a limited supply without actually addressing the bigger question: how can we increase the global capacity to deliver these vital pieces of medical equipment? And so testing equipment is not available in the numbers that we want. The price of ventilators trebled over a week because people were desperate to get them, and mainly produced in Asia. The price was just going up and up, and I know that the British government were trying to get some and then being outbid by another government, and then them probably being outbid by another government. Now, with a global plan to increase capacity, now there is the Foundation for Innovative and New Diagnostics, trying to bring people together, also trying to exchange information about what is useful testing equipment and what is not useful testing equipment.
Right.
And some of the testing equipment has not been good. And so you need if you like, a standard setting organization, or a standard setting attempt at least, where each country can benefit from the experience of the others. So again, here's a classic example of where global cooperation is in everybody's interest. Nobody loses if we increase the supply and the capacity to build the testing equipment and the diagnostic equipment that's absolutely essential, and to build the machinery like the ventilators that are required. But again, look at Africa. Hardly any country has got any more than 1 or 2 ventilators. Look at some of the poorest countries in Asia struggling to find that sort of equipment that they need for the most extreme of cases. And then go back to Africa and think of some of the health facilities, half of them, they say, have oxygen, the kind of medical oxygen that's needed. And so there is a supply problem that has got to be addressed. If it's in our interest to eradicate the disease in the poorest countries, it's in our interest to make sure that equipment is available. So a global plan there is clearly necessary. And even I think the most ardent nationalists would see that it was in their interest, particularly so since there are certain countries that have been good at producing this equipment and produce it in mass numbers and mass supplies. And we benefit from having the international exchange of goods instead of having protectionist policies being applied to stop equipment being available in one country when it's produced in another. And so That's the second issue where cooperation is absolutely essential. The third is obviously so clear that that we not to have done enough in the last few weeks when we had the chance to do it is really unacceptable. Because if the poorest countries, who clearly have inadequate health systems and clearly don't have safety nets, clearly cannot follow the policies that we have been following, of telling people to stay at home,
storing up incomes,
people don't go to work, they starve, telling people yes to social distance in overcrowded communities when it's impossible, telling people to wash their hands when there's no running water in many of these communities, a water supply that is easily available. And yet we are not doing enough to both finance social protection and to finance the healthcare improvements that are drastically needed at the moment. And that is, again, a failure of the international system. Now, the IMF and the World Bank are doing their best, but they depend on their shareholders to make these decisions. You know, when we were dealing with the financial crisis in 2009, all the goodwill within the IMF and the World Bank was important, but it was the decision of the shareholders, of the funders, of those people who are the voting members of the IMF that increased the special drawing rights, that made more money available, and that organized debt relief for some of the poorest countries. And so it comes back to the shareholders and decisions that we have got to make as shareholders, the major countries. And of course, it still remains a majority. Europe and America and Japan are more than 50% still of the shares, if I remember right, of the IMF. And so you're relying on the big countries to be able to say, let's do it. And there's three areas where you've got to act. You've got to act on debt relief. You've got to act on if you like, the ceilings for grants and loans that these institutions have created, which have got to be breached, and you've got to act on probably, I would say, special drawing rights as well. So you've got three sources of additional finance for the poorest countries that can come from the international community. But in each area we've acted, and it's to the credit of people who've been pushing for this, but we haven't done enough. It's clear we will have to do a lot more, and I'd like to set that out.
Yes, and I would, I think so. I agree with you on the items that you've just listed, and I would say that for the near term, I would maybe add one other thing, which is that the poorest countries face a particular set of issues that we've talked about, but the emerging markets also are in trouble because, in a way, the private capital outflows that have taken place have come out of the emerging markets. They're the ones who are struggling to maintain access. And for the next year or so, I don't see much private money going into the emerging markets because markets are going to be risk averse. And so during this period, I think one part of the scaling up of the response of the IFIs, both the IMF and the multilateral development banks, has to also be their scaling up in the middle income countries, because that's where, as we know, the majority of people are there.
And look, I think in the financial crisis, about 20 billion leaked in capital flight out of the emerging markets in the crisis months. I think it's now been about 100 billion that is leaked out. So the scale of the flight of capital, and some of the problems are rather different from what they were in 2009, and perhaps more difficult to solve for some of the emerging market countries. So I appreciate that there are problems that extend way beyond the 76 IDA countries. And in fact, I think more than 100 countries have already applied to the IMF
for assistance. Yeah.
And even before the crisis, as you know, you had countries in difficulty from Ecuador to Turkey. You had the oil price falls and the commodity price falls, and therefore you had commodity producers in difficulty already, and that's been accentuated by the crisis. So we have got a real problem in not just the developing countries that are the poorest countries, but in the emerging markets as well. So let's just look at what we can do. First of all, I think it's important to look at the poorest countries because they have an immediate need, given that many of them are paying more in their debt interest payments, their debt servicing, than they are spending on health. And that's a real problem for countries, particularly in Africa, but some of them in Asia. And many of them were facing problems already in trying to adjust their healthcare system, some moving out of IDA and therefore losing grant facilities that they previously had, some having big programs like for immunization that they could no longer fund. And I think the Centre for Global Development has highlighted, I think, things that are happening in Ghana and Kenya and Bangladesh, where problems already existed about financing existing health provision. So has it been enough simply for the announcement to be made that for the next 8 months, which is from May the 1st, which is a day or two ago, to the end of December, the bilaterals will not call in the debt interest payments, the debt servicing payments. And that's probably worth between, what, 15, 16 billion dollars. It's simply not enough. And so I would say at the minimum for the poorest countries, and these are not just IDA only, but IDA blend countries, you would be talking about at least till the end of next year. So you'd be talking about something in the order of 35 billion from the bilaterals. Then you've got to deal with the debt that is owed to the multilaterals. And then you've got to deal with something that really wasn't the biggest problem in the early 2000s when you and I were working on the HIPIC and debt relief, and that is money owed to private creditors.
Yes.
So you've got 35 billion till the end of next year in bilateral payments, and probably another 20 in payments to the multilaterals that you've got to find a way. It's a different way, but I think the shareholders have got to back that, and there's various facilities within the IMF that are already working for that to be able to happen when people make up their mind to do so. And then on top of that, you've got the private creditors. Right. And I don't think we've found yet a solution. I saw an article from the G20 chair of Saudi Arabia proposing what might be done because they are among the private creditors. China has said that they will act, but we don't quite know what exactly is being done yet. The International Institute of Finance, is available, I think, to be to be part of this negotiation. But I think that's got to happen quite quickly. So you're talking maybe about 75 billion that over the next year and 8 months that should be foregone. And I think that is something that could be arranged more quickly than is being.
Yes, I think that just on that point, the first thing it seems to me is that even the bilateral debt relief that has been agreed at the G20 needs to be operationalized country by country by country, and included in that is making sure that every creditor comes to the table with all their loans, because I'm already reading some media reports about people saying, well, this we didn't think was included, when actually it should be. So the first thing is to kind of deliver on that quickly and give some of
these debt deals, as you know, are very complicated, and some are, the resources are involved, oil and everything else.
Exactly.
So I think it's quite important that we get to the bottom of this quickly, because if you don't have assurance that you can spend money in improving your health system, and this is probably the quickest way that money could be made available.
Exactly, and if you don't do it soon, if you don't do it soon, people are going to make the wrong choices on spending because they're not sure about what they have coming due. And then I think the second thing is, on the multilateral side, the IMF, as you say, has come forward with a program that provides debt service relief for the poorest of the poorest. Not all 76, but about 24 of them through the end of this year, and that needs to be extended. And for the multilateral development banks, and either they need to come up with enough new money to more than compensate for what they're taking out over the next 18 months, and demonstrate that they're doing that country by country by country, not in some aggregate number. Or the argument that is there that some people are calling for, which is for the multilaterals also to join up on the debt relief, I think becomes stronger. So in a way, to my mind, they have a choice. They need to come to the table and demonstrate that they can provide that funding and more through their other instruments and on terms that make sense for these countries in the next few months. And then, as you say, there's the private sector as well, which has to be delivered for them.
Well, I think all three are important, and how we get to the multilateral solution Of course, it depends on what other resources the international institutions are prepared to make available, and that leads you on to the second issue. So in 2009, I think the World Bank, the IBRD facility, was 16 billion in 2008, and then by 2010 was 46 billion. So it was about a three times increase, a threefold increase. And so IBRD is a bit higher now, but I would have thought the same level of increase is going to be absolutely necessary. When you read some of the figures that Mark Lowcock was giving you when you had the interview with him a few days ago, the number of people suffering from starvation or the threat of starvation, he said was going to double according to the best estimates that the World Food Programme had. I think 130 million to 250 million. So you're talking about the immediate need for funds in these countries, and so I would have thought that the grant and lending ceilings of IDA and IBRD have to be increased very, very quickly. And there has been some announcements, but I don't think yet enough is on offer given the sheer scale of the problem we're facing. I mean, 1.5 billion children are no longer at school, and we've got to get them back to school at some point. Millions of people in the informal economy are no longer working and haven't got an income. One of the good things about recent years is that some of the social safety net programs, which have not necessarily been generous, are at least in place so that you can actually get money to people quickly. Conditional cash transfers and mobile banking and so on can make it possible for money, even in some of the poorest countries, to be made available. And so we've got to get these countries into a position where they have the funds to do so. So what do we do about IDA? IDA was about 25 billion a year. It's going to be extended. There's a bit more borrowing involved with IDA. So that could be, 80 billion over 3 years. So that's money additional to probably quite a lot of it additional to what was given last year. And then IBRD raising, and at some point it will reach its ceiling. And then we've got to look at other ways of funding it. And as you know, I've been proposing IFID as a facility for education to give the World Bank and the regional development banks extra money so that in this crisis, you don't cut education to pay for health. You find a way of being able to keep your education improvements moving forward while at the same time funding the health needs that you have. So that's the second area. You've got debt relief, you've got the grant and lending ceilings of the financial institutions, of the international institutions. And then I think you've got to look at SDRs as well, which we can come to.
So just I think on the capacity of the multilateral development banks to lend, and they've recently all had a capital increase. And that's thanks to that capital increase that we're able to see the promises they're making to scale up their support over the next 18 months. But what I think is very important to ensure is that at the end of this process, they don't then say, we've reached what we could do, because the crisis is not ending in 18 months. The shadow of this crisis is going to last for another 5 years, and the needs of developing countries are still going to be there. So they have a combined balance sheet, all the development banks are now of about close to 500 billion or so. Over the next 18 months, so 2 years, they'll raise their commitments and their portfolio goes up to, let's say, 650, 675, 700 billion. But what happens then? And I think the point that you're making, that's the point at which you need to tell the shareholders need to tell the management of these institutions to prepare to go from 700 to $1 trillion as a combined balance sheet over the subsequent period, because that is the scale of development finance that will be needed. Rather than to think about that 700 billion as a sort of steady state and then it's just become business as usual, because the world is not going to be the same thereafter. So I think that's a really important point to signal now.
Yes, and remember that humanitarian aid is somewhat separate from what the World Bank and the IMF are able to offer. And humanitarian aid is essentially under the United Nations umbrella. That there are 25 million refugees, there are 60 plus million displaced people. There are maybe 120, 130 million people affected by conflicts or by natural disasters who are relying on help from the United Nations organizations. And I've thought for some time that here you have the World Bank and the regional development banks that have the ability to raise finance, but the remit is with the United Nations, who don't have the ability to raise finance in this way, other than by begging bowl activities, voluntary contributions that are made by people. And there's something wrong here with the way the international system is working, where you've got the most extreme example of dislocation and deprivation and poverty, refugees, displaced people, and people who are disabled by what's happening in conflicts. We don't really have a proper funding system other than relying on volunteer contributions. Peacekeeping is supported by a UN levy, but humanitarian aid relies on an annual plea by Mark Lowcock and others. And the United Nations, of course, made a plea for 2 billion, and I think half of it's been received, but that's not going to be enough to deal with the humanitarian questions that arise as a result of the pandemic that come on top of the 40 wars that are taking place around the world and the natural disasters from Syria to Yemen to the Rohingya to Afghanistan that still have to be faced, DRC that still have to be faced. So the system of funding international support, when you're trying to prevent a disease going from one country to another, and you're trying to help the weakest links strengthen themselves in their ability to respond to that, it requires not only support for the World Bank and the IMF, but requires support for the humanitarian aid system that is essentially run by the United Nations. And I think coming out of this crisis, we've got to think of a better way of funding so that we don't just go hand to mouth every year when it comes to refugees and when it comes to displaced people and when it comes to people who are in the throes of a situation where there's a conflict and they cannot escape it. So when you look at what we need to do to provide for the poorest, it is greater than what the IMF and the World Bank can actually do at the moment.
Absolutely. So I would say, I think in a way that a good place at which to try and bring this to a close is that, I mean, there's an immediate task. There's sort of fairly obvious in a way why it needs to be done, as you said, and we have to convince people to take action quickly, but I think we know fairly clearly what those actions are in the near term. And then there's a set of issues that we need to prepare for to deal with the sort of follow-up to this crisis, which include things like getting agreement on the special drawing rights, having a much larger lending capacity for these institutions in the longer term, providing money to the UN system to take care of the sort of costs that are both identified now and likely to come up. And then I think what you're also saying now is that there's perhaps a sort of third set of issues which this crisis is a stark reminder that we need to address globalization and dealing with global public bads in a better way than we are able to do today. So we have this sort of patchwork of institutions, some who have the money, some who have the mandate. They sort of try to work together. There's no clear framework for dealing with a lot of global public bads, and the shareholders or the leading members of the global community haven't been able to find common ground to take that forward. And so, in a way, the third bigger challenge is sort of how do we build a better multilateral system, and how do we build a better system of multilaterals that are going to be more responsive and to the needs going forward, rather than sort of the evolving nature of multilaterals that we set up 70 years ago is probably now creaking at the margin, and then maybe more than the margin.
Well, for example, we don't really have an institutional framework that is anything other than year to year, or the possibility of someone coming along to push it to deal with climate change. The nuclear proliferation, I think, as I said at the beginning, there's cracks in the system of dealing with that, and you could move very quickly to another 3 or 4 nuclear weapons powers. Tax havens we haven't really dealt with properly, and there will be an issue at the end of this crisis. Why is all this money leaking out of countries that is needed to finance at least part of it being taxed to pay for decent public services and the protection, particularly of people's health from infectious diseases? And you go through a number of issues that are coming down
Digital
the road.
pandemic. I mean, I think Thierry de Montréal recently was saying that that he felt that the digital pandemic was almost a certainty, and it's just a question of when it happens.
And you've got cyber issues right across the board, and equally, you've got this danger, if we don't find a way of making the existing international institutions work, that we'll move to one world, two systems. You already see some signs of that. The Asian Infrastructure Bank has worked, but you could see why it might be over time an alternative to the World Bank. You can see how an Asian monetary fund could be formed to deal with some of the issues that the IMF deal with. You can see how the regional trade agreements could replace a coordinated approach to world trade through the World Trade Organization. And you could see even a splinter net, two different systems of running the internet, or maybe three or four. You just don't know. And unless we can repair our international institutions and make them fit for purpose for dealing with these very specific global problems that require global solutions, then there is a danger of whether you call it regionalism or whether you call it nationalism, certainly a global crisis that becomes a crisis of globalization. And so I think we've got to be very careful as we come out of this crisis to say, look, issue by issue, we have shown you that the case for global cooperation, even if you think that your country only acts in its self-interest, the case for global cooperation is strong. We've shown it in the pandemic. We're showing it in other issues, and I think climate change will come down the road very quickly, and equally some of the other issues that you've raised and I've raised. So let us see if issue by issue we can have better forms of cooperation. And what's remarkable, about this crisis is that the scientists are cooperating, the medics are cooperating, yes. The statisticians are cooperating. So around the world, there's a willingness to cooperate. I was very lucky because we did a letter to the G20, which you know about, and 200 former leaders signed this with yes. medics and with because people were desperate to show that we could work together as a world to deal with a crisis that was genuinely global. And so if we can, and even American public opinion, which is regarded as more inward looking on these issues, if you look at the studies by the Pew Research Organization, they found that most Americans believed that there had to be global cooperation to deal with this pandemic. And it was top of the list of people's ideas about what was susceptible and what was necessary, conducive to having global cooperation and solving problems through global cooperation. And so we've got to, I think, keep saying during this crisis that whatever the rhetoric is that comes from certain quarters, and whatever the tensions that might exist between China and America over both the cause of this and trade and currency and technology and everything else, there are global issues that require us to have global cooperation. Otherwise, there are no global solutions. And the health crisis we face, but also the economic crisis we face, demands that we work together for the common good. And I think we can then embark on a program of saying, look, let's now look at those issues that are coming down the road, and let's see whether we can find a better way of solving them than we have at the moment.
Gordon, thank you very much for that. I think we will need to have in a few months another conversation which focuses then hopefully on these other issues as much as we do on the current one. But
well, I'll rely on the research that comes from the Global Centre for Development, because you continue to do a very good job raising these issues. And I think it's really important that we try to show people that that global cooperation can work and is working in many areas, and it can actually be increased and extended to be of benefit to everyone.
And it needs to work in our own self-interest, as you say.
Absolutely.
Good. Thank you very much again.
Pleasure.